We're looking at some big changes in education in Pennsylvania. Next on Behind the Headlines.
This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome to a new edition of Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Maura Donnelly. Welcome, Maura.
Hello, Charlie.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
All right. You know, here we talked previously about here in Harrisburg there is a new day. You have a new administration controlled by the Republican Party, and then the Republican Party also controls now the majority in the Senate and the House. So we urge them, and we continue to urge them, to perhaps do something revolutionary and maybe consider that question period. We find that, of course, when the governor would go in front of the legislature and take questions directly, and that would be aired to the Commonwealth. And you find, of course, question period in Britain and Canada are heating up these days.
Very lively.
And yes, and it's actually educating the public. We would like to see that here, but it's just one of those ideas. We'll see if the new administration latches onto that. But speaking of revolutionary, we have a true revolutionary as our guest today.
We do.
Thank you.
Someone who has pioneered new paths in education, particularly higher education. We're happy to have with us Steve Hicks, the president of APSCUF. And Steve, you've been on the show before. We're happy to have you back. Welcome. We have a new political terrain in Harrisburg with new challenges. We have an administration that's talking about a 2-year budget cycle, for example, as opposed to a 1-year budget cycle.
It sure is, yeah.
Yeah, wondered if you could tell us what does, from your perspective and from APSCUF, the statewide union of the faculty of all the 14 state universities, what does this budget situation look like to you and to APSCUF?
Well, it's interesting that you started with the question session there because the Corbett administration has been very quiet. And it's been an interesting contrast with the Rendell administration, who, as somebody put it yesterday, would throw out all sorts of things. You had to figure out which one of the 4 things they threw out was the truth. The Corbett administration has put almost nothing out there. And as you talk to people up in the Capitol, in the offices, they've gotten very little input from the administration as we talk right now. But the budget situation, everybody realizes, is pretty dire. The number that the governor quoted last week was he thought it'd be about $4 billion in the hole for the coming fiscal year on a budget that's in between $28 and $29 million or billion dollars. Sorry. Yeah.
Wow,
I'm not used to dealing with the
billions.
yeah, it's a little hard to fathom sometimes. So that's a pretty big chunk. The biggest part of that comes from the ARRA money, as it's known, the stimulus money that came from the feds the last 2 years was about $3 billion. So that's part of the hole that they have to figure out what to do with. Higher education and basic education were both heavily invested in that money. So we're feeling the trickle down. But right now, nobody really knows what they're going to do, how they're going to distribute the money, what they're going to determine as the income, and what they're going to do with the redistribution based on the loss of that funding. However, you do know the governor ran on a no tax pledge, and everybody on the Hill believes he's going to stick with a no new tax pledge. So they don't see that the income's going to change any. So that's raises a lot of predicaments, and he's talked about a 10% across the board cut. I'm not sure that math really works, but and you don't know if that's 10% before or after that stimulus money. So all those things have to be worked out, and the governor's address is not until March 8th this year, his budget address, because the new governor gets a little extra time. Usually by now we would have heard the governor's address. So we lose a month because of that. On the other hand, they're talking about being done by Memorial Day. So
Should we take bets on that?
Well, I'm not going to take a bet on that, but it's a good point. But everybody believes that's the way they're going to do it. It's going to be very fast. As Charlie just pointed out in his intro, the Republicans have control of both houses and the governorship. So, you know, if they're going to fight, they're going to fight internally, and it's not going to be that one of the parties can hold up what's going on. So it may be quick and painful.
I have a question that I would probably ask anybody who got stimulus money. Everyone knew that that was a one-time, maybe 1.5-time deal. It wasn't going to be forever. Maybe everybody hoped it would be, but it wasn't going to be forever. So there's really no entitlement to that money that was created. Did higher education keep that in mind? Did they make any contingency plans for that, or are they just hoping that that money reappears in some manner?
That's a very good point. The state system, which my faculty work in, received about 9% of their budget from the stimulus money the last 2 years.
Okay.
So the state system tried to be very careful with that money as to how how they used it. They didn't want to turn it into long-term projects. On the other hand, if you look at the budget coming out of the state, that money filled in so that we maintained 2008 levels of funding from the state.
Okay. So,
it's not like it filled gaps,
okay.
but it did. And right now the state.
So it wasn't really a windfall for it to come through.
It was just a fill. It kept
okay.
us from falling backwards. The $444 million that we were budgeted the last 2 years is our 2005-2006 level, and that's what the federal law said. You can't go any lower than that if you take the stimulus money, and we took the stimulus money. So right now the base number we're looking at looks to be the 2005-2006 number. The state relateds took more like 5% of their budget, so they took a smaller chunk of stimulus money, and so their float's a little higher. But both entities, in terms of public higher education, and of course they're a little bit different in this state, as we have a couple tiers, took significant amounts of stimulus money, and everybody was trying to be careful not to use it in the long term. But on the other hand, we expect a long-term commitment out of the state, because they are state. Our 14 are state-owned, and it's the state that's supposed to support them and drive them. And the laws of the state indicate that they have control, both the governor's office and the legislature, over what we do. So we expect certain levels of funding. But you know, that goes back to the big hole we're looking at, and the governor's looking at.
So it definitely has an impact.
It has a big impact. Though we realize that those were soft dollars when we got them, and probably not going to be fully reimbursed. The other part of that was the expectation 2 years ago when they did it was that the states would be back in better financial shape by the time this rolled around. And you know, the state is only just beginning to see some increase in terms of its monthly revenues. I think the hope was that the state would be back to 2008 levels in terms of the revenue generated, and they're running quite a bit short of that. So we haven't recovered as quickly. Of course, that's a historical trend in the Commonwealth. That we always seem to take the hit later, but we catch up later too. So,
Steve, something that that APSCUF has talked about before, something that Patti has talked about before, is the economic impact of higher education on Pennsylvania. When you look at the Commonwealth, one of our true assets is our wonderful university system, and the jewel in that system may very well be is the state system, the 14 universities. What is the economic impact of having this fine system? This has been looked at by a number of different people at a number of different times, and I don't think the people of Pennsylvania can hear this enough, because we tend to forget it. Do you want to address that for a moment?
Sure. Because I think that's an important piece. People don't understand the economic driver that is the higher education and the public higher education in the Commonwealth. The state system of higher education is the 10th largest employer in the Commonwealth. And currently, the last study they did indicated it had a $10 billion impact on the Commonwealth's economy, and that's been several years ago. So you can imagine that when we start talking reduction in budgets, we're talking about damage that can be done. of the 14 institutions in the state system, 3 are the largest employer in their county, and all of them are in the top 10 in their county in terms of employers. So they're all in pretty small communities like Indiana. Even Millersville is a pretty small community where you're at, Charlie. I'm from Lock Haven, and
without Millersville University, there's not much of Millersville.
Right, and that's Lock Haven University competes regularly for the biggest employer in Clinton County. So that impact would be very dramatic if there is a 10% across the board cut. Would mean layoffs. We already are having layoffs because of the budget issues, and we can only imagine it could get worse. The other part of this is President Obama and the Gates Foundation and several others are pushing us to increase the number of degrees we're producing by, they all have different dates, but out there someplace. And a recent study indicated that Pennsylvania needs to have about 57% of the populace holding a college degree. Right now, we're 46th in the country in terms of our population percentage holding a college degree, at about 37%. So we need to increase the number of graduates we're producing, and you can't do that by not having funding and cutting back. So there's quite a bit of economic impact. New Jersey has just released a study last month that was done by former Governor Kane. It's about 140 pages long. The executive summary is even 10 pages, so it's pretty in-depth. But what it says is New Jersey starved their higher education institutions, and it's damaged the state, and they need to, even in these times of bad budgets, to start reinvesting in higher education. And we all know Governor Corbett's a big fan of Governor Christie, and he points to him as a model, and we're hoping that he's seen this study. Governor Christie did not have an instant reaction to the report, because I think his hope was that the commission that he put together to do it would say, we can live without, we're doing well and we can live without funding. Instead, he got a very different scenario. So we have to be careful in terms of the long-term health of the Commonwealth to make sure we keep investing in higher education, because it not only has a big economic impact because of the employer, but it also has a big economic impact in terms of our future and having the workers that we need to do the kind of work that as we shift, we used to be a big manufacturing state. Now we're, no place in this country is a big manufacturing state. We've changed the kind of economy we have to a more green service economy, and we need a different kind of educated worker, and we need to invest in that.
So what are you doing to get the word out in this? You've got a new General Assembly, new governor. How are you communicating APSCUF's position?
Well, we do a lot of lobbying. We're up on the Hill and visiting a lot of offices, and we've been preaching this message. It's both sides of the aisle profess support for higher education. They understand the value of it, and it's not a tough sell, but
it is a tough budget.
But well, and the problem is that higher education is a discretionary piece of the budget. There's such a large percentage of the budget that they can't really cut. I mean, Medicaid, corrections, those sorts of things, there's only so much you can get out of those, and they take a 60-70% of the budget. So, it's kind of like the Obama budget that came out, I'll say recently, since I don't know when people were watching this. But
16% discretion in that.
Right, they're working off a 16%. We have a similar issue with the Commonwealth budget, and the higher education is part of that discretionary funding, and so is basic education. The Rendell administration invested heavily in basic ed and gave fairly large percentages over the last few years. So they got an investment and have grown considerably. But we understand that all those discretionary things are very much on the table. So that's what we're preaching. I mean, make sure when you get down to those discretionary decisions that you want to be careful about cutting higher ed, because it's going to have a much greater impact. We also talk a little bit about what happens, bang for your buck. If you're investing into something with the state's money, how much bang are you getting for it? And most people will agree with us that, you know, you put money in corrections, and I heard the number last week because the corporate administration is interested in the corrections problem. We're spending about $32,000 a year for each person we have incarcerated in the Commonwealth. Well, you don't get a lot of multiplier off the $32,000 you invest in that person. You invest these days about $3,000 a year in a college student. Well, the GI Bill is famous for, they got $4 back for every dollar they invested in those educations. So you can see there's a real multiplier in investing in higher ed. You get back in taxes and income, and the fact that people with college degrees, they don't use as much health care, they don't go to prison as often, they don't they pay higher taxes. You know, there are all those positive economic impacts.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for being with us, Steve, and giving us an update on higher education in the Commonwealth, particularly in regard to the new administration and the new budget situation. We want to follow this closely with you in the next couple months, and we want to thank you again for being with us.
Super. Glad to be here, Charlie.
Oh, it's nice always to have you with us. We'll be back with the second segment of Behind the Headlines right after this.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania Business Council, envisioning a commonwealth in which residents enjoy a very high quality of life in sustainable communities. The Council works aggressively to define key long-term policy strategies and solutions that make the Commonwealth more competitive, creating and sustaining a better Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and the American Home Bank, a nationally chartered and FDIC-insured yet locally owned and operated bank in central Pennsylvania, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by Daily Express, transporting construction, farm, and industrial equipment throughout the United States. And by Penn Waste, your best local choice for your waste removal and recycling needs.
Penn Waste is proud to be a locally owned business. Since the company's founding in 2000, it has employed many of its neighbors as members of a dedicated team of professionals. Penn Waste is proud of its many contributions to the people of its service area through support of numerous community organizations such as Christmas Addicts and the Junior League of York. One more way they improve the quality of life where they live and work.
Welcome back to the second segment of Behind the Headlines. In this segment, we're fortunate enough to have the President and the CEO of the Pennsylvania Business Council with us, Dave Patti. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks, great to be back.
Well, Maura and I are happy to have you,
Yes.
and we just talked to Steve Hicks about education in Pennsylvania, and we want to, about education and higher education. We'd like to talk to you about one of the new administration's central themes, and that will be tort reform and legal reform. And you've just written a piece that appeared in the Central Pennsylvania Business Journal on this issue. Could you sort of give our viewers sort of an overview of the piece, that a summary of the piece?
What I tried to do there was summarize.
Great reviews.
Thanks. Yeah, what I was trying to do is summarize what I would call comprehensive legal reform, and even there are some things that down the road can be added to that.
And the need for these things.
But right, legal reform is something we've been talking about for my 25 years in Harrisburg, and unfortunately, the need to do something hasn't gone away. The will to do something, though, I don't think has ever been as great as it is this year. Certainly, it probably helps that we have someone in leadership in the House, in the Senate, and the governor's office who believe in this. And whose parties have championed it, but I think we've now gotten to a point where the understanding that there are too many lawsuits, that it's too easy to sue, that awards are too much of a lottery, and they're too big, and that hurts our business community, that hurts our medical community, is something that has an understanding at a bipartisan level, at a basic level. Certainly that a month or so ago, the woman who fell into the fountain at the Berkshire Mall in Reading helped drive home to everybody. Since there were some allegations, I don't know if there's ever been proof, but allegations she may have been staging the incident, very much for the ability to sue later. Just what a litigious society we've gotten to and how bad it's gotten. So what we were trying to do here is highlight some of the different reforms.
That, of course, was a huge sensation on YouTube.
Right.
I would think it would be so hard to sue them. She's just texting and walked right into the fountain.
Well, and I mean, she didn't sue, so let's not, I don't want to take it too far. But one of the hallmarks that everyone's been talking about, and that we hope to see action on very, very soon in the legislature is joint and several liability. And joint and several liability is the concept that to make sure that somebody who's truly injured and truly hurt is made whole, that anybody who has any responsibility can be sued and can be made to pay 100% of the damages, whether or not they're 100% responsible. The reforms that a lot of other states have talked about, or even passed now, half of the states, about 26 states, have joint and several reform. Many of them have gone to 100% proportional liability, so that if you were judged to be 10% responsible for somebody's harm or injury or loss, you could only be made to pay 10% of the damages they sustained. In Pennsylvania, you could be made to pay 100%. What we've done as a business community and others, the medical community in Pennsylvania, is said, let's compromise. Let's put the threshold at 60%. If a person is more than 60% responsible, they can be sued still for 100% of the damages, because indeed they bear the preponderance of the responsibility. Now, they can go after the other contributing parties, but to make the injured party be able to collect, they can go after them. But for all of those deep pockets, people who are big corporations, famous celebrities, government entities that people think would have money, but have very little, if any, responsibility for the loss, no, you can't go after them for everything. And we think that this is a very important way.
So anything below 60%,
60
you're
is
just going to be liable for the amount that.
Right, and that legislation passed and was signed by Governor Schweiker in 2002.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because there are probably some viewers who are saying, "Why does this sound so familiar?"
Yes,
this is one of those
we've done this
Groundhog Day
before.
things.
This is,
yes, it did pass
every 5 years, whether we need to or not.
Yes, exactly.
It passed in 2002. Was thrown out by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, not dealing with anything in the merits, but on the procedural passage, that a different piece of legislation was essentially gutted, and this was put in by amendment and done. So Representatives DeWeese and Beyond started a lawsuit, challenged it in the Supreme Court, and it was thrown out. That was during a gubernatorial campaign. Then candidate Rendell said he would sign it if it ever got back to him. In 2005, he had his opportunity. The House and Senate passed the bill again in exactly the same form, and he vetoed it.
Why? What was his reason, Dave? Why did he veto it?
His argument at the time, his legal argument, I think the politics were the reason, but the legal argument was that the difficulty in this is that if you can't sue the deep pocket, whether or not they have the preponderance of the responsibility, then the person may not be made whole. They may not get back all of the loss they sustained. So you got to be able to sue somebody. What he does is he changes the burden of risk from all of us as individuals to those who seem to have an ability to pay. What you really end up doing is making two victims. Because yes, the first person was hurt through we think no fault of their own. Now, that we can get into contributory negligence, but that notwithstanding. Now you're picking somebody else at random almost, because of their ability to pay, trying to find some little connectivity to the incident and making them pay. Now we victimize them, and they're not whole either. So I think this is a position where you'd have to argue two wrongs don't make a right.
So there are a lot of components to legal reform in general. We've talked about the fair share possibilities.
Right. And fair share is a good start, but it does not do everything. Venue shopping, which is a technical way of saying if I'm hurt in my community, I should sue in my community. I shouldn't be able to go to Philadelphia, for instance, which is known for giving the biggest awards in the country, the most permissive courtrooms. The juries that side with the victim, most frequently. Judged to be the worst place to be sued in America. In 2002, the Supreme Court and legislature worked together to create rules that would stop that from happening in cases of medical malpractice. We'd like to see that from the entire business community. So that's venue shopping is an important thing. Product liability reforms, a statute of repose, which is very much like a statute of limitations. Generally in most states, 5 years, though some are starting. 15 years, but some are starting to move to 7. That says, look, I can't. It's not fair to sue me today on something that my company made 40 years ago, and base it on today's technology, today's engineering, today's science.
It met the standards 40 years
ago.
ago.
It met the standards then.
Sure.
So at some point we got to say, sorry, enough's enough. And 15 years would be nice. As I said, though, because medical technology, other sorts of industries, software, moving so fast.
Some people move problem.
Yeah. Asbestos, though, really has been handled separately. And in fact, we have now at the federal level trust funds with some $30 billion in them. You know, in fact, we need a small technical, I'll call it technical amendment to Pennsylvania law that allows you to name the trust fund, because you don't really have a successor corporation if they went bankrupt.
Right.
In this case, you have
the
trust fund.
Don't exist anymore.
And we don't want people to double dip. You don't want them to go after the trust fund and some other manufacturer. Yeah. So just name the trust fund and go after that, because the assets are there. Okay. So I think we can handle asbestos. Innocent seller. You know, if I'm a retailer, you know, you own a store. I come in, I take something off the shelf, take the box, give you the money, walk out. I feel like I'm injured. I sue you for selling it to me. You didn't design it. You didn't make it. You didn't train me in the use of it. It's not your fault. We should protect you from that. And then there's some things for the medical community still. Doctors, certainly in terms of what's called the certificate of merit, but who is an expert witness to qualified to say what another doctor did. Kind of a technical issue, but needs to be fixed. But I think a simple one, and here in the mid-state, Senator Pat Vance, a nurse, has been very much a part of a really good bill that's moving through the General Assembly now, known as the Apology Bill. And this is a simple one, and this only applies to medical, but it is just a simple understanding that if we're hurt or a loved one is, you know, something goes wrong in an operation, or we have a bad outcome if they die, really what we want is some empathy, some sympathy, you know, that human understanding. You know, I'm sorry that things turned out this way. I know we talked to you about risk, but it you know, I'm sorry it went this way. Doctors are told not to say anything by their lawyers, you know, because that'll be used against you. It's an admission of guilt. So we want a law that simply says it's not an admission of guilt. It doesn't mean anything went wrong. It can't be used against you, but it is the right thing to do. Right. And I think that's, you know, that's really at the bottom line for all legal reform. What we want to do is get back to everyone treating each other in a civil manner and doing the right thing and making injured parties as whole as we can without creating more victims.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Well, thank you, Dave. We really appreciate that update. Sure. And we will follow the administration, Maura and I, and see what progress is made on judicial reform, legal reform. And we hope to have you come back and give us an update then. We'll be with you next week with a new edition of Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.
Yeah.